Before I begin, POIs in chat, please. Please do not unmute yourselves. That's not something that I would prefer. My name is Bea, she, her, they. That's it. Okay. Right? 3, 2, 1. Let's go. In a fragile democracy wherein progressive activists have achieved the first step of succeeding and implementing their preferred politicians within the new government, the importance is at this point in time is the creation of a united front in order to sow the seeds of democracy, of progressivism, especially for the long-term benefit of that government and of that nation. While we cannot fiat the policy, we can imagine how this is likely to occur. Obviously, we will not call them out publicly. We will discourage, for example, common threads or hate brigades. We discourage public protest or mass demonstration that is against people or government leaders that are supported by our own political activist group or political progressive party. Second, in cases wherein there are disagreements due to change of strategy or perhaps scandal, the motion does allow opening government to benefit from saying that we can settle this privately. So within our own internal discussions, within our own internal communications between the activists, for example, and people who are within the government. But third, if external actors such as the media or opposing political parties, we can encourage the progressive political parties to coalesce and agree on a public relations strategy on how to communicate our feelings about, current controversies or current issues and potential criticisms regarding a specific member of public office. This debate, while it does say it takes place in a fragile democracy, takes place in a spectrum of fragile democracies. So this includes weak democracies, for example. So this is democracies with normal governments, for example, that may or may not have elected into power certain authoritarian or strongman leaders. It could also mean new re-established democracies, such as democracies and governments that came out post-conflict. So these look like Libya, East Timor, the Philippines, for example. The first thing we're going to push at Prime Minister is unity. There are a few reasons why unity is important. First, it is often necessary to create unity among progressives in order to compete with other political alignments. So cronies that are trying to reassume their position into power, conservatives also that are trying to compete against fellow progressives. Two, unity is the most important factor when citizens decide which type of leadership to trust. And insofar as we are assuming that this government is already progressive, so it's either fully progressive or dominantly progressive, we want to be able to allow the citizens, regardless of whether or not they align with progressivism, to trust us, for example, or believe in the government. Third, there are a lot of state initiatives that require unity and buy-in within the political party. So these look like referendums, constitutional changes, choosing who must be contained in the new government or who to choose in that next election. Fourth, outside the political party, you want people to follow the government, abide by the policies. But fifth, there are a lot of projects outside of those that concern campaigns or electability, such as outreaches, for example, to the most vulnerable and affected parts of the nation, especially if in the context of a weak democracy wherein you are post-conflict. Public criticism compromises this on 4 reasons. First, it reflects badly on progressive activists. It makes them look like they are fractured, misguided, and they don't understand what they really want. Second, it often can be exploited by authoritarians and conservatives, often to stigmatize them, to suggest that the criticism espoused by these activists is used as leverage to prove that even people who even align with them politically don't support them. So what more for people that do not align with them politically entirely? Third, the nature of the criticism that comes from activists is often violent, unfettered, and unproductive if you allow it to be public. So often through the high emotions espoused by the progressives in times of fragile democracy. A lot of these protests, mass demonstrations, and use of words on social media can be weaponized by people on the outside. Fourth, this often carries into long-term after future elections and allows authoritarians to use these instances as leverage for why not to re-elect a progressive democracy. The counterfactual on why this does not exist in government's preferred world is because, one, we are likely to be geared towards resolution insofar as it is private, because there is no incentive to be loud, there is no incentive to want to be heard, and therefore the method of criticism is specifically through a one-on-one or a group to another organization discussion. But second, even if we still project criticism in the way that is violent or unfettered, it does not translate into public backlash or stigma from other people who are not within the progressive party, because it is not because they're not able to see it at the end of the day. At the end of this argument, we prove that unity is important, criticism is an affront to this unity, and we mitigate the primary case coming from side up. Before I proceed, CEO.
Why is there a need for violent and unfettered criticism on Gov's world insofar as these progressive groups align ideologically?
So it may be different because just because you're within the same ideology, some people may commit scandals. You may think that some people may be a bit more progressive. There are certain spectrums into the degree which you are progressive or not progressive, and all of these meaningful micro differences may lead to conflict. You still have to assume that conflict can still exist, and therefore you still can assume that people will respond to it by wanting to criticize, by wanting to call them out, by wanting to do mass demonstrations in public. The next thing I want to prove is that this improves the community of a fragile democracy. So let's assume that there is no short-term threat to replacement. So no conservative or no crony is out there to get the government that is dominantly progressive. There are still a couple of reasons why this is important. First, it's broadly because of trust in leaders, which is important for four sub-reasons. First, other than compliance towards policies, it's also about political long-termism, establishing that a government, progressive government, is viable such that we don't regress back into authoritarianism or conservatism. Second, it's important for historical encoding to ensure that the stuff that we record, the educational curriculums that we have from them pointed out, to prevent future cases of historical revisionism in favor of conservatives or fascists. But third, it's also about rebuilding democratic structures, insofar as we want to have a stronger judiciary, a stronger legislative branch, a stronger executive branch, for example. And it's necessary to prevent people who may have perverse incentives to tilt it in the favor of the elite and the hegemony. Criticism compromises this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because it's difficult to galvanize within the movement in order to push for this. So this often looks like, for example, if there is a lot of infighting externally, and that infighting may often result in violence, for example, unfettered hate speech, for example, people retaliating because there is an interest for people within the establishment or within the government, even if they are progressive, to stifle a lot of the mass demonstration that occurs on the ground, that creates in ongoing resentment within these people, and therefore makes it difficult for them to galvanize, not just within the context of political stuff like lobbying or elections, but also stuff that's not necessarily political, like outreaches, for example, in supporting the vulnerable and the needy. But second of all, it's difficult to galvanize outside of the movement. People who are emotionally tired of the mess of a fragile democracy do not want to be hassled by being led by a fractured government. So less people are more likely to give time, money, resources to rebuilding projects, outreach projects, referendums, into electing these people again. But third, often a lot of these instances of, massive call outs, public discourse, criticism are picked up by international media, which makes it significantly more difficult for international NGOs and governments to provide aid and support to the democratic rebuilding process, because they perceive that this is a government that makes people unhappy. This is a government that we should not collaborate with because we're not sure as to whether or not our expertise or resources can be supportful to them. We would suggest on the counterfactual, if this public criticism does not exist, we are more likely to have more buy-in, not just locally, but as well as internationally.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech, inviting the Leader of Opposition here.
All right, just give me a second. Let me rearrange my notes. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. The most important question is not about how we get to a revolution, but about what happens the day after revolution. We believe stagnation is death, and we need to eventually evolve in order for us to prosper and eventually create better governments from this. Let's take a look at a case from opening government. They said that we will not have any protests. We're going to make sure that everyone hides behind closed doors like a dictatorship that does not want any form of accountability. And they want to settle this without the public eventually knowing or writing for this. The problem here is that, number one, this is a missed opportunity for you to have any form of self-accountability that you could eventually use within the media to show that you're actually moving the government into something that's actually new and actually progress. And that is the very definition of progressive, because you are very different from the previous governments who have done things behind closed doors instead. But number two, nobody actually knows that there is any form of change when you don't actually visibly show it. You need to create a culture of change so that people are actually scared that you are actually reacting to certain forms of criticisms that are legitimate towards you, so that people know that you are the real deal, rather than the possibility that you might be a Trojan horse that just happens to climb up the ranks of progressive politics because you grew up in a region that just happens to be way more progressive instead. There is a possibility that the only reason why you are part of this government in the first place because you have calculated the risk, thinking this is the government that would allow me to get into power and have me to do or carry out certain things. Then there's also the possibility that progressivism is multifaceted. You may have someone who is progressive, but they might be bigoted in different things. For example, they're bigoted when it comes to disabled people, or probably they do still harbor certain anti feminist ideas that are a bit more subtle, but they're progressive when it comes to economics. So you need to sort of like talk about these kind of things in order for you to filter out these possible Trojan horses, so that when the next election comes in, you have more people who are able to replace this kind of people, and it's quite visible that this change actually happened instead. So you don't actually get the hypocrites. But the third impact from this is that when you have visible hypocrites who are maintained and no one exactly talks about them, this is where more conservative society who are able to use this as a Trojan horse and pretend to play the progressive game and say that at the very least, we are not scandal ridden. At the very least, we are not corrupted. So they can ride on that, when the reality is that they have more fascist-like ideas that they bring to the forefront, but they could cloud themselves under the idea or the banner that they are more pure in comparison to the corrupted progressive, so-called progressive coalition that we are not supposed to protest or fight against instead. But fourthly, the problem here is that when it comes to bad faith actors, they don't care if you are fractured or not. They don't care if you are united or not. They will find any way in order for you to engage you and so on. But if you are, let's say, fractured in itself and bad faith actors use it, at the very least, you could demand concessions from progressive governments in order to go further and actually carry out the policies that they have promised in a manifesto, rather than just using it as lip service, versus when somehow, let's say, if you are perceived to be united and you don't talk about it, you had all the harms I mentioned earlier. Plus, they said that we are walking into a dictatorship because no one is allowed to talk about certain things. All of a sudden, there's no form of protest, despite the fact that progressives are not saints without any form of scandals. You eventually need people to say something rather than keep quiet and be perceived that it is a cult of personality. There is no genuine progressive politics. Why don't you vote for us instead? At the very least, we deal with these possible ideas. Now, there are three things I'm going to talk about, because I believe OG is already out of this debate from all of this. First of all, what exactly is progressivism? And number two, what are fragile democracies? And within them, we're going to talk about how we change the culture, political culture within a country. And thirdly, what are these progressive governments and how do they react to criticism? Let's talk about progressivism first. The problem with progressivism is that it's often on a scale. So some people are perceived to be progressive, but there's a possibility they're not inclusive in different things. They cater to specific groups of people, but they're not pushed to act in a certain way. So what you create here is that when you have a scale, you create a lame duck government that is able to use the aesthetics of being progressive, but not actually carry out the bills that they want. Maybe they want some kind of police reform, but they might say that, well, there's a possibility that we need to win on certain things instead. And they don't actually use the power that they finally have. They don't actually create reforms when for 20 years that they promised reforms in the first place, because they eventually need to push certain way and so on. And they realize that the biggest voice is not actually the progressive voice. Number two, there is a huge possibility that these progressive movements can immediately turn to become regressive at the end of the day, because no one exactly pushes them. You also have to understand that culture eventually changes and they need to move in a certain direction. So there's a possibility figures who are perceived to be progressive in the first place are now perceived to be as regressive because they don't react to this kind of criticisms instead. But thirdly, the worst part of all, they stay stagnant. They don't change wherever they are because they feel comfortable. This is harmful because this is where corruption eventually happens. They feel as if that there is no form of criticism. Barisan Nasional in Malaysia in the past used to be relatively more progressive in comparison to all the political parties, and they became the party of quote-unquote stability, but from that stability is where you get corruptions. Second level here, what are fragile democracies and how governments eventually react to this? When you're talking about fragile democracies, you have pockets of conservative society that would still hold a dominance on what exactly is the discourse. If you don't become active in part of the discourse and actively condemn the bad actions of the government, you have conservative society demanding forms of concessions. They are able to strong arm progressive governments and stop certain things in their tracks because they perceive that they might be losing the voter share in the future instead. So even if you have a progressive manifesto, it is really easy for them to control the narrative and demand concessions. And then you don't have to wait for fascist leaders or neoliberal ideas to be enacted. The progressive government is the one that comes in and actually take these ideas instead. Second level to this is that how you eventually create change within the culture itself. If you stay stagnant and you don't talk about it, this is where people don't feel as if that there is a unique selling proposition by the progressive coalition, and people don't actually see it instead. So you allow complacency and allow conservatives to use this as a Trojan horse and say that, well, there is no improvement in the lives of most people, especially economically, no improvement in your whatever you believe in whatsoever. So why don't you go back to the conservative movements? And the people who are most likely to fall under this are on the fence voters who only wanted to vote for progressives because they think they are able to create change in the first place. And when they see people are being hypocritical, no one exactly gets condemned for the bad things that they do. This is where they are less likely to vote for progressives again in the future. And this is how progressive coalitions eventually fell. But thirdly, what are these progressive governments and how they react to criticism? When you want to carry out something, you need the ability to imagine what the world will look like tomorrow. You create a world where progressive governments don't imagine how exactly they can push their progressive base. They are less likely to create other progressive bodies that might be able to supplant these progressive coalitions because people aren't able to imagine that in the end. So at the end, you create progressive coalitions that are regressive and they won't actually push towards how can reform society within this world instead. And they're less likely to explain the nuances when people have to make hard decisions, thinking that they will always be safe in it. And with that, we believe that Owo takes it.
Thank you, Speaker.
Set up my timer. Yeah. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 ways I'm going to step this. Firstly, a bit of coaching on what OG necessarily push. Secondly, then what substantives were necessarily not responded to by OG, why necessarily they become less relevant within this. But lastly, why then like opening opposition still points out and posits the biggest harm and the best benefits that can come off here, right? Let's begin number one. What's the culture and the problem within the OG's case? I think OG's case was generally problematic when they tell you that the mechanism in which they want to control progressive governments is through like secret meetings and, like hidden ways in which activists should then talk to governments. Number one, the question then becomes is, would those governments necessarily respond to you without exactly pushing why or proving why governments respond to these secret meetings? I think it's problematic. But number two is that the reality of how secret meetings don't necessarily bring a lot of benefits within status quo is the fact that you don't get the ability to have discussion publicly. You don't have the ability to have discuss, oh, this is going to be integrated. But let's first take down the problem with OG when it comes to the natural benefits that come from OO at the very least and not responding to it. Because two things that were important within Terence speech. That number one, you need to capitalize on the media insofar it's important to your party. The setup here is simple, that the reality of how governments and what they react to is that politics and principles are intertwined. Like governments want to retain power. At the same time, they sell the idea that their principles are extremely important. The problem here that Terence notes to you is that these two things are oftentimes either overlap or diametrically opposed. The moment where it's diametrically opposed, there is the need for you to call out that action. Insofar as it is secret meetings, we don't see where necessarily, especially since retaining power is so important, like OG says, is the point in time where they wouldn't be progressive. It's the point in time where they backslide. That's how the backsliding argument manifests itself. So importantly disregarded from opening gulf. But secondly, you need to then understand, and here's where I lead back into the media and especially pointing out like the substantives that were extremely important, right? Then opening out of discussion publicly and how progressive governments would react, especially when you add in the addition of media and public discourse, is that the moment they reject those very, very perimeters is the moment in time their voter bases and their group of people will say, what the fuck is going on, right? This is the moment in time where you're able to force the incentive structure of governments to react to public criticisms. But secondly, this also means that the likely reaction of this parties or governments will probably look like having public discussions and discourse. There's the ability for you to then, on the second level of analysis, to control media narratives around you. The problem with opening government and what they fail to realize is the moment where you allow conservative like media to be the dominant narrative within your own like media space, and you have radio silence, is the moment in time where you allow more problematic ideas and narratives being pushed upon there. You need to, at the very least, have voices of discussion on why certain things need to change. But secondly, what does this reaction oftentimes look like? This probably looks like explaining certain policy-making decisions, because we note that policies are oftentimes tough, and you oftentimes have to make trade-offs between a thing and another. We think that progressive, like this discussions, are important to hold these states, hold these governments accountable. Because the moment in time where they can justify a certain policy, I think progressives aren't necessarily going to go hoo-ha. It means about finding solutions and finding ways in which we're able to better those positions. But thirdly, and this is where we handle internally within the party as well, super important, right, is the fact that there are always going to be politicians who are opportunists and parasites within those very structures. You need to eradicate those very individuals in order for you to achieve those principles that you want to set, your progressive principles. The moment you allow these people to come into power is the moment in time you will never get a future progressive party. It's the moment in time where you allow this like conservative narratives to continue propagating, and you will never see another progressive party in the future, right? This is way problematic on Gov, because they need to sell the idea as to why another progressive party will come into power when the moment where they realize that a lot of the times you allow these very parasites to come into power, very parasites to take the top of the reins and continue to control you. I don't see why, like necessarily without media attention, these politicians would necessarily care, right? Cool. Then lastly, right, doing the important comparative here is that there is an inherent need for you to evaluate the structure as well. You cannot purely let governments to run on the public perspective of progressivism, but at the same time, do not do those things. Therefore, there's an inherent need for you to have media coverage. If you do not, it's way more likely that such governments would just basically ignore you, would not respond to you, insofar as the incentive structures do not react to that. The way in which you invoke reaction through is firstly making it public and clear. This is in line with the prior framing as to what governments react to. Well, this is more likely that they would not have reacted to secret private meetings. So the whole premise coming out from Gov is already out of this debate, insofar as we tell you secret meetings don't work. What is this second layer of harm here that clearly points out that you don't get anything insofar as OG's case is important? But sure, before that, I'll take one POI from closing. 3, 2, 1, opening. 3, 2,
This
1.
makes no
surely authority.
Sorry?
So this makes no sense. We are still a dominantly progressive government. So especially since no criticism is publicized, there's a focus on our projects and achievements. When you allow the criticism to exist, that's when conservative opinion on progressives can come into the spotlight.
Yeah, it will happen anyway, because the reality of it is you need to control the media narratives around you. On your side is radio silence. You have nothing. You don't have criticism towards you. More likely than not, the pockets that control the media are going to be the conservatives. You wouldn't have that in the first place. But what we pointed out to you, and oh my God, I already said it earlier, right, is that these discussions will probably look like public discussions, will probably look like ability for you to, tell why you do certain things and everything, and also be solutions as to how you want to reduce those things, to how you as a progressive party want to progress in the future. It is important to note here, panel, it's simple, right? This debate is about politics. There are 3 different stakeholders that are important. Your party, the politicians within your party, and obviously the people who are going to vote in your party. If you lose out on one major structure, you already lose out on everything. So it's very important that you retain the voter base that you talk about and retain and explain why you're progressive in the first place when it's clearly in line with you wanting to have discussions and discourse. You lose out all that, you already lose out on the major stage, right? The reasons why you come into power in the first place, or progressive voter base starts to like, what the fuck is going on with this government? I don't want to be in line with a government that continues to propagate problematic principles without necessarily explaining what is the reasoning behind those principles. I think it's simple. It's about transparency. What OO provides to you, most importantly, is the transparency of how governments should operate. And accountability can only come when governments are transparent and willing to come to the round table and have discussions. Insofar as OG has come out today, I don't see where this transparency happens. I think it's the same as an authoritarian regime. No matter if you label yourself as a progressive government, there's no point. Labels are just labels. What do you do to change that? For that, thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Invite a member of Parliament.
Hello. Can I be heard and am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll perform my POIs via chat. Starting the speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. We agree with OO. Accountability and the dynamism of these progressive parties is the most important thing within this debate. What we will do is to disprove the OO mechanism, and then from there, disprove the OG importance, and prove why we're the only side who's able to have accountability for these progressive parties in a way that is productive. The first thing I'm going to talk about is why the private settlement is the only way to keep progressive governments to account. But firstly, why that accountability is the most important thing possible. So OG's strategy is just to say that this really isn't important. We think that it is. And the reason for that is just the fact that we want to make sure that these governments are not corrupt. We want to make sure that their policies aren't like regressive. So why is this? The first is just to talk about the fact that conservatives are often able to get the same levels of unity and mass mobilization that OG wants to claim as a benefit. So they say unity makes us seem attractive, but they don't prove why the conservatives are not able to do the same thing. To a large extent, they actually are, and that's been demonstrated by many ways that conservatives often protest through things like mass mobilizations, through motorcycle rallies under Bolsonaro, etc. And to a large extent, they're also able to co-opt many levels of progressive rhetoric. For example, Duterte in the Philippines still talking about caring for the poor, etc., but under a non-progressive lens. But the second thing and the more important thing is just to say that corruption and many things like corruption, like regressive policies, are often the things that are going to be the triggers that cause the absolute destruction of the credibility of these progressive governments. So what they'd say is that just because this progressive government is progressive does not mean that it doesn't engage in the same things that make the fragile democracy fragile. So things such as violations of human rights, things such as corruption within the business sector are still things that these progressive governments do opt into. And when these things are often exposed, and they inevitably will by things like the free press, oftentimes they stay on the news cycle for months on end, creates an automatic discreditation of many of these progressive governments. And that means that there's an automatic shift in power towards the conservatives, regardless, given the fact that these things will happen. So key examples of this include Operation Car Wash in Brazil, because the progressive government was corrupt, the Liberal Party in the Philippines becoming complacent, and as a result being replaced by Rodrigo Duterte. So OG can have all the stability that they want, but insofar as they're not able to prove that corruption and many of the systematic things that are holding the progressive parties back from long-term stability and ability to hold office still remain, eventually they will still have to be ousted out of office. The second part of the argument is thus why the public infighting is a bad idea. So OO talks about accountability, but if we prove this, we'll be able to prove why their measure of accountability will not lead to anything, as if anything, counterproductive. The first thing is to just talk about the fact that this becomes an intense dramatic spectacle whenever they bring these things up publicly. So the media will often pick up on these and has many incentives to make the critiques seem far worse than they actually are. No matter how much sensibility is within the arguments that's run by these progressive politicians, this is the case because oftentimes when people aren't that educated, the news media needs to make it seem as dramatic as possible to make it seem that it's palatable to the average individual. Oftentimes people are only enamored by personal politics, and as a result, they make it so that these things are exaggerated, such that it's a personal attack rather than a policy one. So for example, saying that this president from like another race is like a slur. So the party as a whole thus needs to make an immediate response against the wing of the party, which is criticizing the rest of it. And oftentimes the incentive is a complete discreditation of these wings in a way that's often personal and fundamentally unproductive. So for example, saying that these people cheated on their wives, saying that these people are also similarly as corrupt and far worse than us. And there are two structural reasons for this. One, the leaders at the top feel like it's a personal attack and is against their honor. And insofar as these politics are still motivated by the individuals who are controlling these parties, oftentimes they're likely to hit back in a way that's personal, in a way that's uncouth and against their interest. But only urgency makes these people irrational. The news media as a whole on their side, when it's public, pressures these politicians to make immediate gestures of rebuttal against these people. And oftentimes that means that these politicians aren't able to counter or think about what their next move really should be. That means that they go towards anger, go towards irrational responses. So in that exchange, I think that these more progressive wings of the party that are willing to, for example, dunk on corruption or able to critique on these other parts of the party are often just gonna lose because the fact that they don't make up the majority. Oftentimes, they're the ones who are poor because the fact that they don't opt into corruption. And that means that the majority party will likely be able to stand its ground, say that critiques are dumb, and make it so that these political parties are just discredited insofar as they're not given any more party support. And the conclusion to this is twofold. One, nothing happens. The progressive wing as a whole dies. And so they often become independent. And so they're not able to pass any sort of progressive policy or any sort of change the progressive policy as a whole. But secondly, the entire progressive policy just loses its strength insofar as it loses a part of itself due to the infighting. And that means that the conservatives are more able to win. Why then is private discussion the only thing that can work? I'll take O now.
Yeah, why would conservatives suddenly shut up when you use secret meetings instead?
No. This is what we're going to talk about now. So again, this is mostly on them. What we're talking about is why we're uniquely able to make ourselves less corrupt over time through these private meetings. So like on either side, if the conservatives don't shut up, we don't really care. What matters is that we're able to outshine them through becoming less corrupt over time, being able to make better policy over time. Why does the private discussion work? So the nature of a fragile democracy is often quite simple. One, there's often a 51 to 49 seat split between the progressives and the conservatives. So what that means is that the Liberal Party as a whole desperately needs the more extreme, more just wings of itself. So the very threat we propose of fracturing is in itself huge because the fact that the liberal wing of the party knows that if they don't have these people's support, oftentimes they'll go towards the other part of the Congress, which is often more conservative part. Oftentimes they don't want to have this limitation of political power insofar as they want to make a mark on the country now and pass as many reforms now to be able to solve the fragile democracy. Oftentimes that means that they're desperate to hold on to these people. So that means that if it is a private discussion, there's more likely to happen. But suddenly, and this is the more unique thing out of OO, they're more rational. So the reason why is because of the fact that they have more time to be able to make these discussions. You dodge the concept that these attacks are really personal and up to the public. And as well, you have time to be able to think on these progressive decisions, time to realize that these aren't personal attacks against you, but are a discussion about the future of the party as a whole and how it can keep dynamic over time. And insofar as the people of the country are generally progressive and would want more progressive ideas like land reform and end to corruption over time, we propose that many of the more moderate people within these progressive and liberal parties would probably be willing to give up things like the worst of practices, corruption over time. And what that means is two things. One, we're more in line with the general responsibility of the motion. This house believes that insofar as we eliminate more corruption out of the party as a whole, that's good for the nation state. But suddenly this keeps us dynamic. And insofar as individuals within the nation want more progressive policies, we're able to achieve more of them through the motion. We're able to win out on that. For all more, proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Inviting the member of opposition here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Pronouns are he, him, here as well. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to make something very clear right at the start of my speech. No team in this debate has the burden of trying to help progressives retain power post an election cycle. OG and CG fall into the same trap of imposing this burden upon themselves to retain power post an election cycle. I think if a shady progressive loses his next election cycle because he's corrupt and scandalous, we say that's fine, because that's how election cycles work and that's the fundamentals of a democracy. OG's model only sows the seeds for the entrenchment of power via their shady under-the-table dealings with progressives. I think this stance was entirely fatal to the Gov case. They go against their principles of trying to form a stable democracy or forming a democracy to begin with. What is CG's CEO's burden here? Very simple. We're going to prove to you why criticism is pertinent to the running of a fragile democratic state and how this evolves into the functionality of a fully democratic and developed democracy. All my responses are going to be integrated. I'll try flagging them out. First extension then on why we have the best means of checks and balances on policy itself. Firstly, on why is criticism important on policy implementation. Criticism that follows on policy implementation means that governments need to push for nuanced and holistic forms of legislation. So it means that policy adaptation is better due to this activist movements pushing for policies that they want, and because of the interest being similar, they're able to use this similarity of ideologies to have better persuasion to push for political policies. So I think since the party itself is progressive, it's easier to check and balance these parties because your alignment is relatively similar. I think furthermore, we think there's a trend of these parties having a larger amount of power and then pushing politics for electoral agendas, and will to some extent make policies that are not politically correct, not in the interest of the people, and that's exactly what we want to prevent. Because government has this misconstrued world where in which progressive governments are all inherently benevolent. They assume that all progressive governments are going to be that of functional governments and that of are going to be effective. I think this isn't a benevolent democracy. I think this isn't a benevolent dictatorship. You cannot just hand over power to progressive and expect them to be doing good. I think you need criticism. But second layer then, on why criticism on policy implementation is likely going to be holistic. I think this is directly clashing with OG on CG on their skewed perspective of what criticism is going to look like. Firstly, on the fact that these are groups with similar interests. I think both of them want to see progressive things like progressive taxation. Both want to see things like similar interests, right? They want to see things like the legalization of abortion. So the criticism is likely not going to be violent or fatal to the stability of the nation itself. Because it's important to note here that progressive groups likely lose their voice insofar as the government loses its seats in politics or in their party, or the government itself collapses. Because progressive groups are likely to be more clamped down in a world in which conservatives are running the show. So progressive groups have a natural incentive here not to be violent, not to be so damaging towards the criticism of the party to the point in which it collapses the entire government. I think then government can't draw parallels towards how Republicans criticize the Democrats. Political ideologies are polar opposites in those scenarios. You will never see compromise except for them bashing each other. So that's never going to happen on our side of the house insofar we have similar ideologies and similarly want to stay in power. Secondly, is the fact that they are cognizant to the problems of the inheritance that the ruling government has inherited, right? Gov claims that these progressive groups are going to criticize them for problems they inherited or problems out of their control. Of course, that's not going to happen. These aren't conservative groups. They're not going to do that because they are similar groups and they're the same groups that helped you get into power to begin with. They rallied for you. They were the ones fighting side by side, trying to install you as political leaders so their voices would be amplified. I'm unclear as to why is it so that now all of a sudden they're going to become completely oblivious to all the problems that you inherited from previous governments or from your colonizers or whatnot. Lastly, we're going to engage on the worst case of Gov here, on the worst case criticism on our side of the house. I think here's where we become hyper charitable and we bite the bullet to Gov. Let's say a political leader in your progressive government is corrupt, he's authoritarian, he's scandalous. We say screw it, criticize him all the way you like, and criticize him like any other leader. Because when you want to build a democracy, not a benevolent dictatorship, you see if he gets ousted for the power the next election cycle, we say so be it. That's what a developed democracy look like, where we hold our leaders accountable. We think it's perfectly justified for us to throw out progressive leaders who are so corrupt, right? Because I think that's what a democracy actually looks like.
Right.
Then third layer on how there's an ability to have better policies in the long term. Due to this party being progressive and this activist party being progressive itself, they have similarity of ideologies. They have the most functional forms of policy reform and implementation. Now, their ideas come from all branches of progressive and from the same spectrum we talk about. Because I'm inclined to believe that a ruling progressive government probably has those within the same spectrum of progressivism later. I think they're all similarly aligned on their side. On our side, we allow the voice from the larger, broader perspective of progressives as a whole. Second extension then on the checks and balances on the evolution of power within the state. How does power evolve in fragile democracies? I think within weak democratic norms, the propensity towards political corruption and weak frameworks of criticism all exist within fragile democracies. So this looks like the INC in India and the ANC in South Africa. We think a lot of these fragile democracies, the ruling government or the one that comes out of whatever conflict they are, is the one that holds the large amount of power. OG concedes to this when they say progressive governments hold the most amount of power. So we're debating their world here. I think you're probably going to see the centralization of power in Gov's world, in which these political parties probably are going to retain power by suggesting that they're maintaining things like political dynasties, or B, trying to push the narrative that these are the political parties that got you independence, sort of freed you from your oppressors, and therefore they should be the ones retaining in power. Secondly, on why the checks and balances of power important to prevent centralization of it itself. I think prolonged periods of ruling enable things like dominant parties to conflate their political party as the state itself. In developing democracy, as the country goes through a period of economic growth and the strengthening of social services, the long-standing political rulers and sign any and all all go towards the party itself, right? So it looks like Barisan Nasional in Malay, like in Malaysia, stamping things like welfare handouts with things like party colors, making it hard to distinguish assistants and stuff like that. I think what you effectively do here is to entrench the cult of personality on the political party leaders who have dominated the ruling power and a culture of respectability. I'll take a few right now. Yeah.
OGCG.
Yeah, OG.
You're still applying the standards of a perfect democracy when the alternative is literally authoritarian backsliding. Why not criticize privately? Why not criticize in all these ways?
Yeah, exactly. Private criticism probably is never going to be functional on your side because you don't put political leaders in the limelight. The way in which you get effective criticism and get policy change is when people are literally strong-armed into making changes. When people go out and do things like moderations, they have debates out in public with like the progressive government itself. That's when progressive governments are basically forced into bringing policy reform and are forced into pushing like even more progressive policies because they're literally put in the limelight. On your side, where you have under the table, behind the door, like some kind of like shady dealing nonsense. I think that's why progressive governments have decreased incentives to ever want to comply with you as a progressive group. But then thirdly, on why is CG able to prevent the worst forms of backsliding on our side uniquely? I think we called them out right from the start. These forms of backsliding that I have illustrated to you occur long term, but OG's model literally feeds into that. They allow for long-term backsliding. We allow for criticism consistently. We call out undemocratic actions the second in which we see them. OG doesn't have a way of dealing with forms of backsliding that occur over the long term. I think for all those reasons, side with zero.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Inviting the final proposition speaker, the government whip here.
All right, just give me a second. Okay, so for POIs, just POI me via chat. State if you're from opening or closing. I'll be sure to take you before I end my speech. Okay, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Benny Gantz's coalition party in Israel failed and allowed for Netanyahu's Likud party to return. Years of criticism towards the Aquino administration have led to resurgent strongmen in the Philippines like Marcos and Duterte. And Lula da Silva almost lost a re-election in Brazil because of union workers' rhetoric who supported Bolsonaro. Opposition benches' benefits are all contingent on proving that discourse, check and balance, and whatever means of public criticism ultimately leads to structural change to which they failed to prove why elections ultimately become better under their side of the house afterwards. If this debate is about a deadlock on structural change, we win because we prove to you that we prevent further harm towards backsliding on nascent democracies and fragile democracies overall. There are two primary clashes by which we'll engage in this round. The first, which is the best strategy for political change? And second, where do we best transition to a strong democracy? Let's first deal with closing opposition. Closing opposition's win condition is only contingent on check and balances. If I prove they don't get check and balance, and I also prove they don't get the other benefits that are contingent on check and balance, and they ultimately lose this round. There's three responses to this. The first is that criticism happening in opposition gets out most of the time. And the problem that we posit to you coming from my member earlier is that the media, who oftentimes spins and controls the narrative around these criticism, makes the criticism personal towards these politicians. Which is to say, even if you get huge swaths of criticism towards a very corrupt government, it all gets washed down and watered down towards personal attacks on the individual because of how the media likes to spin drama, for instance. That's necessarily important because you don't need criticism towards policies, but you get criticisms towards the individual, which makes them so that even if you necessarily get to criticize them, you don't necessarily get to remove all the necessarily harmful objective nature of the politician or of the party themselves. But second, no criticism oftentimes does not equal to leading to check and balance automatically. Oftentimes, if you want to get full check and balance or the entire system, you would have to overhaul the entire government to begin with, overhaul the entire democracy, and undermine the process and the services to begin with. And that's necessarily important because even the extent to which they'd have to get check and balance would mean to overhaul the entire system, which is necessarily harmful for multiple structural reasons. We told you earlier that this democracy is weak. We can't necessarily undermine the full extent of the government right now. But the third response here is that even if holding politicians to account does not lead to better politicians being elected. And it's the fatal assumption that they get from both opposition teams to begin with. Because even if you do get to remove all these bad politicians, that doesn't necessarily mean that better politicians will take their place afterwards. That's a fatal assumption that both opposition teams fell to. They have to prove as to why better politicians will ultimately arise. The point that you remove these corrupt structures. Because as we've seen time and time again in multiple countries, you can just have corrupt structures go up again. E.g., for example, when you remove Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, there's a huge criticism towards her. They just replace them with the Tatmadaw military. So all these things prove necessarily, and this is important for the debate, because even in their absolute best case scenario where they get check and balance, that they don't prove why the aftermath is much better. This is important for two reasons on the clash. First, their strategy ends in no political change. But second, they don't get to make a strong democracy, which is also their win condition. Then opening opposition, let's deal with them now. Their primary win condition is that progressivism is bad because of aesthetics, the Trojan horse, etc. If I disprove this win condition, all their arguments and structural reasons also fall. There are three responses to this. The first is that this is generally false. Internal party politics also exists on their side to reel in politicians. The reason why this works is because of funding in the future of the party. If you have a scandal, if you have a bad politician, if you have a corrupt politician who does not do anything, then obviously they are a double-edged sword to the party as well. They will also be removed from the party. They will not be fielded to run for the party. This also the missing mechanism to opening government's response towards opening opposition. Obviously, if your candidate is bad, they won't necessarily be allowed to run for re-election. But second response here is that just vibe check this. Politicians can get away with so much on their side of the house. If they are incompetent as opening opposition claims, then they won't get re-elected to begin with because they aren't doing anything to begin with. The important part to weigh here is this, because even if under our side of the house, wherein some politicians will have to stay in power for a couple of years, at the end of the day, they can be removed without that much chaos ensuing. The trade-off you have to take under the side of opposition is that you have to have that level of criticism, that level of chaos ensuing in the public space for them to be removed for the same amount of benefit you can get for less trouble under our side of the house. The third response there then is that they claim afterwards that these politicians will be regressive. Like, why? Like, this is just disingenuous to clash to begin with. In fact, we would claim regression is more likely on the side of opposition, the point which you push governments to defend themselves because they are bombarded more and more criticism. That's how you lead to more conservative politics arising, which is necessarily bad because conservatives will always backside on democracy. That's how you lead to more authoritarian strongmen getting up to begin with. But lastly, they then claim that the government will be stagnant. Again, government stagnating can happen on both sides of the house. The question is, where do we get tangible changes? And this is important because the changes you get in opposition at best are only the changing of the guard. You only change politicians, but you don't necessarily prove as to why you get like better policies from these politicians being changed. Because ultimately, if they claim that they don't change the structures, then the same structures can proliferate in their side of the house. They will keep these politicians, being corrupt in their side of the house over and over again, even if you change into new politicians. So ultimately, you also create stagnation under their side of the house with the changing of the guard. This is comparative importance because the strategy on underside of opening opposition also leads to a deadlock on their side, or you get a backsliding on stagnation in democracy under the side of opposition. This is the missing weighing mechanism from opening government because OG only talks about voters. We assume voters on the side of opening opposition, and it's still far, far worse. Ultimately, opening opposition's benefit is discourse, but discourse is fruitless, the point to which it gets the opposite negative effect because the mechanism and incentive structures don't change, which is harmful for fragile democracies. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Conservatives will still criticize, and this means that backslide will happen. What is it not mutually exclusive?
Can you say it again? That was really soft.
Conservatives will still criticize, and this leads to backsliding anyway. Why is it mutually exclusive?
Yeah, because conservatives aren't the people that you want in power. The point that you have conservatives, you're going to get backsliding in all forms of policies. That's literally what we saw with Rust Belt Midwest supporters supporting Trump, leading to him in 4 years of really bad COVID policy, for example. So I'm not sure why that's a comparative you want to defend. But lastly, why do we win the election cycle even in a worst case scenario? Number one, because we can better hold strong coalitions together, which won't necessarily happen on their side of opposition. The point which coalitions will dissolve because they don't want dirt on their reputation. But number two, we enhance better policy and good policies. So even if you have good policies under both sides of the house, they're going to be overshadowed on the side of opposition. People on which bad policies and drama will always take the spotlight. But lastly, we also win the right to represent the party under our side. So we make sure that party politics is better under our side because we field politicians and candidates who have the right reputation and have the right background. This is important because we already have multiple incentive structures under our side to prove that we hold politicians accountable under our side. You remove all these structural accountability mechanisms under the side of opposition, the point at which you bring it to the public limelight. Lastly, we win because we necessarily prove to you that we hold corrupt politicians accountable. But But even if you don't buy this, we proved to you why we get to prevent the shift toward conservatives. But even if you don't buy that, we told you why ultimately we get a stable government, which is important to help the most vulnerable on the ground level if all comes to fail. For all these reasons, propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. Inviting the final speaker of this debate, the opposition whip here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Just give me a second. I'm starting my timer. Okay, I'll be going in 3, 2, 1. The trap proposition falls into was that they needed to preserve the party's dominance, but this is the exact ideology what plagues post-conflict states, and I feel as though instead of the solution, they provided the bane that kills the progression of these states. So proud to oppose. A few strategic observations here. Firstly, about OO and their assumption about how violence is going to be what these activists resort to. First of all, violence is what entrenched their states into such a shitty situation. I don't know why they're going to be inclined into using it. But secondly, liberal and progressive values are more often not resorting to peaceful reform. That's why they're going to have more nuanced versions of trying to have reform. And finally, violence means that they're going to be collateral damage. I'm not inclined to believe that movements are going to want to sacrifice people on their side and sacrifice capital on their side. Their entire analysis and half of their case is already gone. But CG had an assumption that the shady under-the-table criticism is going to help. I'll deal with this in my rebuttals and how this principally contradicts what these actors stand for in this debate and how they ultimately lose. But on to OO. They said people will change. I agree, but the fatal flaw in the case stem from the fact that they were not able to analyze why pushing for policies that was policies that were regressive in nature actually happens. They needed to show us why this occurs, because in order for them to win over proposition, they needed to show on how on their side reasons such as protection of political dominance and pushing for populist policies was something that did not happen. But they can't win this because of the clash wash, because of the lack of world building. And one of the most important things, which was the push of the image argument coming in from opening government, they never dealt with that. So in order for them to actually edge out over other teams, they needed to weigh about how accountability led to firstly a better democracy, but also better politics happening inside of this state and inside of this country. They ultimately did not do this. They failed their job and they are out of this debate. But on to my rebuttals. They said on a comparative, it's better that we let these governments go risk-free because they are better than their predecessors. I think the only thing genuinely true in this prop case was that currently they are better than their predecessors. However, the nightmare of corrupt governments that proposition rants about is essentially what happens on their side. Because if you want to make this the metric and use it, you still lose because of the analysis that Devesh gave you. ANC and Congress in India were progressive parties, but literally flipped ideologies in the long term because there was a centralization of power and there was no check and balance system. So they were able to use this power to push things that will policy that will help them win elections. And then they talked about backslide. Backslide is worse on your side because on our side, even on the worst case, there's some sort of minor disturbances in image, but overall, we're able to get many benefits, which I'll talk about later, such as political stability and integrity. And I'll deal with this later. But then they said check and balance will not happen because of criticism. Okay, even if it doesn't happen, I'm not seeing how your illogical mechanism of not voicing out this in the public is going to help. Next, it is about how criticism sparks discourse and political ammunition, where you're able to better garner and target a larger amount of people who will cause the uprise and basically cause backlash to this government. However, even if we take CEO's Brazilian example about how bad criticism could entirely influence an entire election, the point literally contradicts this thing, and our point still stands because criticism did spark some change given their own analysis. But they said even if you remove bad politicians, it's not true that less corrupt politicians will come into power. Probably we will have better politicians because there's individual leaders that are problematic and scandalous, and once you remove that, people are going to be better. Otherwise, you remove them again. And then they talk about how conservative politics occurs when you bombard them with criticism. On a scale, it equalizes because radio silence never led to accountability. I don't see how you solve it. However, this is worse on their side for the simple reason that to some extent, criticism does influence politics. However, the accumulation of power corrupts parties, which is going to be happening on their side. And then they talked about how a stable government is justified because we'll let them do this, and I'll be talking about why this is bad. But onto my main clash. I'll take the POIs in chat. First clash about how is the discoloration of social image worth it? Proposition's only push was you don't look unified. I feel as though even if you don't look unified, you socially look more benevolent because you're willing to listen to the criticism and use it as a mechanism to better your party and your state. Secondly, you look more benevolent when you don't listen to these parties, when there's no criticism, and when you let these parties have a centralization of power. I don't see how you have legitimacy on your side of the house. But CO was unique in this debate because instead of dumping benefits, we dissected and gave you actual analysis on how we get three-pronged form of benefits. I'll be talking about this later in my clashes. But the next class, on which side are you able to have more organic and progressive change? Proposition lacks analysis, and this is why they lose. Because if there was no analysis about why governments have better incentive to push for better policies, when they don't have any sort of criticism, they lost the clash because they watched it. Finally, Devish also talked about how scrutiny was a self-correcting mechanism, and we just took this clash because their entire solution was just radio silence or under the table criticism, which does nothing. But we told you about how criticism that follows on policy implementation means that governments are going to push nuanced and holistic forms of legislation. And finally, we feel as though because we're able to get better policies, governments are also, after governments are under criticism, it paves a way to develop better policies. Furthermore, it's easier to persuade these governments on our side of the house because of the ideological proximity that we have, and both governments and movements have progressive values. So in effect, we're able to better convince them on our side of the house to push better policies, but we also set a social norm in which this criticism acts as a self-correcting mechanism. But before that, I'll take your POI.
Opening, closing.
Opening.
So you fall into the same issue with opening opposition, wherein you're assuming that no criticism will take place. If you agree with O that non-progressives will criticize either way, doesn't that mean that the criticism and accountability still occurs through discussions internally? Why does it exclusively need to be
Okay,
public?
I get your point. I get your point. The difference here is that even if it's happening internally, you're not able to have much of a target reach, which was the entire analysis that Devesh gave you about how if you diverse, if you diffuse it into a larger crowd, if you diffuse it into a larger amount of people, you get more social ammunition, which means you get more social change. We already explained about that. But we're able to have a better check and balance system on our side of the house because they said you don't need to do public calling on their side of the house, but I already mentioned right now in the POI. But we feel as though criticism fuels norms such as governments facing backlash if they do something which goes against progressive ideals. This means governments are less centralized on our side of the house, and we're able to decentralize power, and in importance and in the long term, you're able to have better elections because you don't let them spiral out of control. Because it entrenches a cult of personality in party leaders who have dominated and are of the ruling party. This looks like the ANC using the legacy of Nelson Mandela and using it to this day, and they're still in power to this day, even though they push the shittiest policies ever. But eventually on how on our side we get nuanced and proportionately better democracies. They never responded to the push that Devish gave you about how if there's radio silence, they spiral out of control because they now have centralization of power and they can use it for their elections. But we told you about how check and balance systems mean democracies are more morally cleaner because there's a fear of backlash and people are likely to adopt ethical strategies. And it sets a social norm because there's no tolerance for malpractice, and this is based on the analysis my previous speaker gave you about. So we take this debate for the simple reason that not only do we have better democracies, at the end of the day, it's a more nuanced form of politics, and we're able to better help our democracies and our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. With that, we have come to the end of this debate. Thank you for the debate. I'd like all the debaters to cross for a second virtually. I think because this is a hall, I think all the judges would move on to the another breakout room, if there is one, to deliberate the verdict.
Thank you for the debate, everyone.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks, everyone.
Salamat, that means thank you in Filipino.
Salamat.
That's it.
Maraming salamat.